He lost in the highest court in the land, a 6-3 ruling, unambiguous. The tariffs were unconstitutional. The legal mechanism he had used to impose them did not give the president that authority, and the Supreme Court said so plainly and on the record for the entire world to see. Most presidents facing that kind of definitive legal defeat would recalibrate, would find a path that worked within the boundaries the court had just drawn, would at minimum pause long enough to assess what the ruling actually required of them. Trump signed a new executive order within hours, different legal authority, same tariffs, 10% on every country on earth simultaneously, and then the next morning he raised it to 15. Europe had spent months carefully and patiently ratifying a trade agreement that was supposed to end the chaos. A deal signed at a Scottish golf course that businesses on both sides of the Atlantic had restructured their operations around. A deal with a ceiling, a hard-agreed limit on how high American tariffs on European goods could go. Trump's new order pushed effective rates past that ceiling before the ink on the ratification vote had even dried. So on a Monday morning in Brussels, Europe did something that sent shockwaves through every market on Earth. They pulled the plug. And in a back room in Paris, something far more dangerous was already being loaded. To understand the full significance of what Europe did on that Monday morning in Brussels, you have to understand what had been built at Turnberry and how much had been invested in making it work. Because the trade relationship between the United States and the European Union is not simply the largest bilateral commercial relationship in the world, though it is that, representing over $1 trillion in goods and services crossing the Atlantic annually. It is the economic spine of the entire Western alliance structure, the material foundation underneath the political and security relationships that have defined the organization of global power since 1945. When that relationship is stable, when the rules governing it are clear and respected by both sides, the broader architecture of Western cooperation functions with a degree of reliability that allows governments, businesses, and investors to make decisions with sufficient confidence to generate the growth and stability that the system requires to sustain itself. When that relationship is in active and unpredictable conflict, when the rules are being rewritten unilaterally and without warning by one side while the other side is still operating on the assumption that the previous rules apply, the damage radiates outward in ways that no targeted intervention can fully contain. The Turnberry Agreement had been the moment when everyone on both sides of the Atlantic had allowed themselves to believe the chaos was ending. July 27, 2025. Trump and von der Leyen at a Scottish golf resort. The photographs of the handshake had circulated everywhere and had been received everywhere with the relief of people who had been living through months of escalating trade warfare and had finally been given a credible signal that the worst of it was over. The terms of the agreement were specific and they were binding. American tariffs on European goods capped at 15% inclusive of everything. Duties cut to zero on aircraft components, generic pharmaceuticals, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and designated critical raw materials. A framework that gave European exporters the predictability they needed to plan, and that gave American consumers and industries dependent on European inputs the cost stability that the preceding months of tariff escalation had destroyed. Europe had celebrated the agreement with the enthusiasm of a continent that had genuinely feared the alternative. Businesses had restructured supply chains around the new framework. Investment decisions that had been frozen during the peak uncertainty of the trade war had been unfrozen. The European Parliament had begun its ratification process with the expectation that the formal vote would be a procedural confirmation of an agreement that was already functioning in practice. The trouble had started almost immediately after the handshake photographs were taken. The Trump administration's approach to the agreement it had just signed had been characterized from the beginning by a pattern of behavior that European trade officials had documented carefully and that would become central to their eventual decision to freeze the ratification vote. Steel and aluminum tariffs had been expanded in ways that created ambiguity about whether they fell within or outside the Turnberry framework's 15% ceiling. In January 2026, Trump had threatened additional tariffs specifically targeting 8 European Union member states, framing the threat explicitly around his administration's desire to acquire Greenland, a Danish autonomous territory and part of the European Union's broader family of nations. The European Parliament had responded to the Greenland tariff threats by pausing the ratification process for the first time, a warning signal that Brussels had hoped Washington would receive and act upon. Diplomats had worked to calm the temperature. Talks had continued. The ratification vote had been rescheduled for Tuesday, February 24, 2026, and the trajectory had appeared to be back on a path toward formal completion of an agreement that both sides had publicly committed to honoring. Then Friday, February 20th, 2026 arrived, and everything that had appeared to be back on track was revealed as an illusion maintained by the mutual willingness of both sides to avoid confronting the underlying instability directly. The Supreme Court's ruling landed with the force of a constitutional detonation, 6-3. The justices found that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the legal authority Trump had invoked to impose the sweeping reciprocal tariffs that had been the primary instrument of his trade war, did not grant the president the authority to levy tariffs. The law had been designed for genuine national emergencies, for responses to wars and terrorist attacks and threats to national security of the kind that required immediate executive action outside the normal legislative process. Using it as the legal foundation for a comprehensive restructuring of American trade policy was, the court found, a misapplication of the statute that Congress had passed and a usurpation of the constitutional authority over trade that the founding document had assigned to the legislative branch rather than the executive. The ruling invalidated trillions of dollars in tariffs. It created immediate legal exposure for the American government from businesses that had paid those tariffs and that now had grounds to seek refunds. The number of companies that had already filed or were preparing to file legal claims for tariff refunds under the invalidated framework ran into the hundreds, with the aggregate financial exposure to the United States Treasury estimated at over $160 billion. The world watched to see how Trump would respond to the most significant legal defeat of his presidency on one of his signature policy commitments. The answer arrived within hours: a new executive order, a different section of trade law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. 10% tariff on every country in the world, simultaneously effective immediately. The morning after, the rate was raised to 15%. A post on Truth Social warned that any country attempting to exploit the Supreme Court ruling would face even higher duties. The message from the White House was explicit. The tariffs were not going away. The legal mechanism had changed. The policy had not. European trade officials did the arithmetic on Trump's new tariff order within hours of its announcement, and the conclusion they reached was the conclusion that made the Monday morning emergency meeting in Brussels unavoidable. The 15% Section 122 tariff was being applied on top of existing tariff structures in ways that pushed the effective rate on numerous categories of European goods past the 15% ceiling that the Turnberry Agreement had explicitly established as the agreed maximum. The ceiling that both sides had negotiated, that had been the central commercial commitment around which European businesses had restructured their operations and European negotiators had made the concessions necessary to reach agreement, had been breached, not through ambiguity or interpretive disagreement, through arithmetic. The numbers exceeded the agreed limit, and the European Union's own legal assessment, completed within hours of Trump's executive order, confirmed that conclusion without qualification. Europe had not moved. Europe had not changed any term of the agreement it had signed. Europe had been preparing to cast the formal ratification vote that would have locked the Turnberry framework into binding law. It was the American side that had exceeded the agreed ceiling through a unilateral executive action taken in response to a domestic legal defeat that had nothing to do with the transatlantic trade relationship. The emergency meeting of the European Parliament's Trade Committee on Monday morning, February 23rd, was not a meeting called to debate whether Europe should respond. It was a meeting called to determine the form the response would take and to ensure that the political unity necessary to make that response credible was present before it was publicly announced. The representatives who assembled that morning came from the full spectrum of the Parliament's major political groupings, and they moved with a speed and a coherence that surprised observers who had spent years watching European trade politics operate at the pace that 27 member state consensus normally required. The decision that came out of that Monday morning meeting was announced with the kind of deliberate plainness that communicates more than elaborate diplomatic language ever could. The ratification vote scheduled for Tuesday, February 24th was cancelled, frozen, suspended indefinitely. The European Parliament would not be formally locking the Turnberry Agreement into binding law on the date that had been set, prepared for, and publicly committed to, not because Europe had changed its position on the agreement, not because European negotiators had identified new concerns requiring resolution before ratification could proceed, But because the agreement that Europe was being asked to ratify was no longer the agreement that America was honoring in practice, you cannot ratify a commitment that the other party has already departed from. You cannot formally bind yourself to a framework whose ceiling your counterpart has already exceeded through unilateral executive action. The logic was simple, the communication was precise, and the message it carried to Washington was impossible to misread. A deal is a deal, and you just broke it. The global reaction began arriving before the Monday afternoon press conferences had concluded. European equity markets fell sharply as investors processed what the freeze meant for the transatlantic commercial relationship whose stability had been priced into valuations across the continent since the Turnberry handshake photographs had circulated 7 months earlier. The DAX dropped. French and Italian indices followed. The sectors most exposed to American market access, German automotive manufacturers, French luxury goods producers, Italian fashion and food exporters, watched their valuations contract as the certainty that Turnberry had provided was replaced by the particular quality of uncertainty that is most damaging to investment decisions. Not the uncertainty of a known bad outcome that can be planned around. The uncertainty of an outcome that cannot be predicted because the rules governing it are being rewritten in real time by someone who has demonstrated they will rewrite them again whenever domestic circumstances make rewriting them convenient. The businesses that felt this most acutely were not the large multinationals whose financial scale gave them sufficient resilience to absorb policy volatility while adjusting their strategies. They were the medium-sized exporters, the family-owned manufacturers, the precision engineering firms and specialty food producers and pharmaceutical component suppliers that had made specific and in some cases irreversible operational decisions based on the Turnberry framework. Companies that had signed multi-year supply contracts with American customers at prices calibrated to the tariff structure the agreement had established. Companies that had invested in production capacity expansions justified by the market access the agreement was supposed to guarantee. Companies whose entire forward planning had been constructed around a set of rules that had now been rendered unreliable by an executive order signed in Washington without consultation, without warning, and without any apparent consideration of the contractual obligations it was disrupting on both sides of the Atlantic. The uncertainty was not abstract, and it was not temporary in character. It was structural. Because the problem was not simply that Trump had imposed new tariffs. The problem was that the legal architecture underlying American trade policy had been revealed as fundamentally unstable in ways that made any agreement negotiated with the current administration impossible to rely upon with confidence. The Supreme Court had struck down the legal mechanism that had been the primary instrument of Trump's trade policy. Trump had responded by finding a different legal mechanism and deploying it immediately to produce the same policy outcomes the court had just ruled unconstitutional in their previous form. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 came with its own constraints. The authority it granted was explicitly temporary, limited to 150 days, with a maximum rate of 15%. After which congressional approval would be required to extend the measures. The 150-day clock created a new layer of uncertainty on top of the existing chaos. Businesses could not make investment decisions on the basis of a tariff structure that might be completely different in 5 months depending on how a congressional vote went in a political environment where no outcome could be predicted with confidence. The entire framework of forward planning that modern international commerce requires was broken, and the businesses on both sides of the Atlantic that depend on that framework to function were absorbing the cost of that breakage in real time without any clear timeline for resolution. Europe was not alone in its response to the chaos. India had been in the process of finalizing arrangements for a trade delegation visit to Washington, a visit designed to advance the bilateral agreement that Indian and American negotiators had been developing. The visit was canceled. The bilateral agreement India had reached with the United States had established its own tariff ceiling, and Indian trade officials were conducting the same arithmetic that European officials had performed, assessing whether Trump's new executive order was compatible with the terms of what had been agreed and reaching conclusions that made proceeding with the delegation visit premature at best. China issued a formal statement calling on the United States to abandon its tariff regime entirely, and announced it was conducting a comprehensive legal review of the Supreme Court ruling's implications for its own trade relationship with America. Brazil found itself in the paradoxical position of watching the flat 15% global tariff actually represent a reduction from the rates it had previously faced, creating a situation where Brazilian exporters were momentarily advantaged relative to competitors from countries that had negotiated specific bilateral deals now potentially compromised by the new executive order. The entire architecture of bilateral trade agreements that the Trump administration had spent a year constructing was now sitting on a foundation that the Supreme Court had just declared unconstitutional in its original form. The agreements themselves had not been directly invalidated by the ruling, but they had been negotiated in an environment where the threat of the now invalidated tariffs had been the primary American leverage point. Reopening those negotiations to account for the changed legal landscape carried its own risks for both sides. And the $160 billion in potential refund liability that American and foreign companies were pursuing through the courts represented a fiscal exposure to the United States Treasury that was compounding the diplomatic damage with financial pressure whose full dimensions had not yet been calculated. Bernd Lange, the German member of the European Parliament who chaired the International Trade Committee and whose committee had made the decision to freeze the ratification vote, did not speak in the measured language of institutional diplomacy when he addressed reporters. He enumerated the specific instances in which the American side had departed from the terms of the Turnberry Agreement since its signing: the Greenland tariff threats of January, the